Hello, I'm Tracy Grimshaw. Welcome to A Current Affair. Getting Australia back to work. That's the mission for the Prime Minister as we move towards easing COVID-19 restrictions. The restrictions are costing the economy $4 billion a week, and the challenge now is returning 1 million people to work. A short time ago, I spoke with Treasurer Josh Frydenberg from Canberra. Treasurer, thank you for your time. 6 or 7 weeks ago, when you were budgeting something like $200 billion worth of economic supports for this pandemic, did you imagine that we would be where we are now after, this many weeks?
Well, we've made great progress as a nation on the health side with the flattening of the curve. I mean, you remember, Tracy, we saw cases increasing by more than 20% per day, and now they're under 1% per day, and that's through the brave work of our health workers, but also the millions of Australians who have followed the social distancing and the isolation and the quarantine restrictions that have been put in place. But we're not through it yet. We don't want to see a second wave of cases as they saw in Singapore and in Japan. And we're very conscious of the hit to the Australian economy, with the economic indicators only going to get worse before they get better. I'm talking about unemployment rising and GDP falling. So we're very conscious of the challenge ahead, but Australians can be confident about their future.
How far ahead are we on what were your best guesses back then?
Well, we were just trying to avoid a major lockdown as we saw in Europe. And if you look at the United States, their death toll is extraordinary. More than 65,000 deaths and more than 50 times Australia's death rate when you take into account even their bigger population. So we really have become a world leader in the way that we've responded to this pandemic. But no one should be complacent. Patience is a virtue, and we need to ensure that people get back to work and that the impact on the economy is minimised.
Okay, so now we're talking about reopening industries, reopening the economy after only 6 or 7 weeks, which feels like months ago, but it is only 6 or 7 weeks. What will be the priorities? What industries can safely reopen first?
Well, the first thing to say, Tracy, is we need to take the medical advice. The second thing to say is we need to focus on areas where we can minimise the health risk and maximise the economic gain. And that means having the protocols and the processes in place so that if there is an outbreak, that we can quickly contain it. When it comes to the particular areas, we want more kids back at school. We also want the logistics sector to come back, because that's going to be important in moving freight across the country. And of course, we want people in the hospitality sector to be coming back as well.
Okay, let's talk about the hospitality sector. Sorry, I'll ask you.
That's all right.
You're right. I'm presuming that's not a COVID cough.
No, I'm pretty safe.
Okay, good. Let's talk about the hospitality sector, because we have 1 million people out of work and almost half of them are in hospitality. How can we get pubs and restaurants back to work and open and operating profitably when they can't pack in the numbers of people that they need to make a profit?
Well, these are the exact questions that our medical experts are working through and are being discussed at National Cabinet. National Cabinet set forward 15 condition precedents, conditions that needed to be satisfied before we could actually ease the restrictions. And they're the sort of things that they're considering as to whether you can get less people into a restaurant than previously by ensuring that the social distancing rules are maintained. But the key issue here is if people are going back into hospitality, people are drinking at pubs or buying a meal at their local restaurant, that's good news for the farmers, because the farmers are now, in some cases, coming out of drought, getting good rains, producing good crops, and they need to find a home for their produce.
Of course, that's a very valid point, but the feedback I keep hearing from pubs and restaurants is they're keen to come back, but they need to be able to make a buck. And how do they make a buck when they can only have, say, a third of the number of people in their restaurant or a quarter of the number of people in their pub? How are they going to do that?
Well, over time, as we continue to suppress the spread of the coronavirus, then the restrictions get eased. So while you may start incrementally, you build up over time. And I think that's an important point of this, is that the restrictions will be eased with a staged approach.
You said today that some sectors would come back more slowly than others, and I guess we've just touched on one of them. Doesn't that mean that some people in certain sectors will need to still be accessing JobSeeker and JobKeeper beyond the Prime Minister's 6-month cut-off at the end of September?
Well, again, no one has a crystal ball to tell you what the situation will be in 6 months. What we always wanted to do was to prepare the nation for the long haul, and fortunately the Australian public have come with us. But when it comes to some sectors like tourism, obviously until the borders are open, that's going to be a sector that's going to be hit harder than another sector where, for example, manufacturing or construction, where people are getting back to work quicker than in those other sectors. So we understand that the JobKeeper and the JobSeeker support packages are critically important, helping to put food on the table for families, but also to keep people connected to their employer.
So is it inevitable that for some sectors, JobSeeker and JobKeeper will continue beyond September?
Well, look, we're not crossing that bridge right now. Where we are at the moment is we're seeing real progress on the health front. The economy has been hit. The economic indicators are going to get worse before they get better. But the quicker people can get back into a job, that will be good news for them and for the economy, because history shows us, particularly in the early 1990s, Tracy, if people stay out of a job for a long period of time, it becomes increasingly hard for them to get back into the workforce.
Just on that, some businesses won't survive this crisis. What do you think the Australian workforce will look like on the other side of this? How will it have changed?
I think there'll be more e-commerce. I think people are going to be quicker adapters to new technologies. And the other area that will, I think, change is around global supply chains. I think Australians recognise that we need to be self-sufficient in certain areas, not in all areas. We don't need to produce every good or service. I mean, we can't, and it's not economically feasible to do so. But there will be some areas where we need to reassess those global supply chains and ensure that the nation is secure even at times of global crisis.
But if we're looking at firing up manufacturing again in Australia on some level, don't we need to make labour cheaper? Isn't that a key issue?
Well, the issue is not about cheaper, it's about making labour more flexible. And having workplaces that are able to work in accordance with the most productive outcomes. So we're very much focused on those productivity enhancing reforms that produce more output for the same input, and that means more money into people's pockets with more jobs and higher wages.
You've talked about industrial relations reform. What sort of concessions are you going to ask the unions to make?
Well, we'll work constructively with a whole range of stakeholders through this process, not just employee representatives through the unions, but also employer representatives through the various national groups. And as you saw with the JobKeeper package, we had a suite of industrial relations changes, while temporary, facilitated that payment. So I think it augurs well for future conversations, but I think what we can do is work constructively as we have through this crisis with many of the stakeholder groups.
Okay, big day coming up on Friday. Thank you for your time.
Good to be with you, Tracy.
Treasurer Josh Frydenberg. Damien Miller lives for his beautiful daughter Madison. Confined to a wheelchair after a freak accident, Damien says Madison's love keeps him going.